Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David Carr, Union Theological Seminary, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the fourth panel on biblical literature. And I had the privilege, first of all, of introducing Professor Konrad Schmid of the University of Zurich. He is a professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient Judaism there. I've known him for almost 3 decades. And at the time, he was getting ready to publish his second book, which played a very important role in the discipline of Hebrew Bible studies and helping scholars rethink how Israel's origin traditions were related to each other, the ancestral and Exodus traditions. In the meantime, he's written across a number of other very different fields. He's someone who doesn't get confined in just one area. He's written on the book of Job, a commentary on the first part of the book of Isaiah, on the theological development of biblical law, on a synthesis of the history of Israelite literature. And he's currently involved in an emergent project, possibly on the emergence of egalitarianism in the ancient West Asian world. Just gives you an idea of the range that he has. So when Mark van Mierup asked me about possible people who might be a good person for this panel, Konrad Schmid was an obvious choice. So anyway, I'm so excited to introduce him and his paper on reactions to the Achaemenid Empire in the contemporaneous literature of the Hebrew Bible. Professor Schmid.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the organizers. Before I start, I need to make a disclaimer regarding my title. Strictly speaking, there is no biblical literature in the Achaemenid period, simply because there was no Bible yet. Of course, many writings and texts that later became biblical were composed, but the term and the concept of a Bible as a unified collection of sacred texts, be it the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Bible, only originated in the first millennium CE. But conventionally, the term biblical or Bible can also be used in an anachronistic way, which is how I am also using it in my title. In order to deal with the biblical literature of the Achaemenid period, there are 2 options at hand. The first one would be to enumerate, discuss, and historically evaluate the different texts and writings of the Achaemenid period in a more or less encyclopedic way. This road shall not be taken here. There is not the place and the time here for such an enumeration, and this also has been done elsewhere, masterfully by David Carr and less masterfully by myself. And you can see here a possible enumeration from my book. Nevertheless, I allow myself the observation that among all geographic areas that we are discussing in this conference, the biblical literature is probably the quantitatively largest portion of written texts from the Achaemenid period, and also the globally best known, which has, of course, to do with the very broad and long reception history of the Bible. There is a second option that particularly considers what Thorkild Jacobsen called the politicomorphism of ancient Near Eastern and thus also biblical religions in his book, The Treasures of Darkness. I suspect the title was chosen by the publisher and not by the author. Due to its geopolitical location in the southern Levant between Mesopotamia and Egypt, and due to their character as small political entities, Israel and Judah and their successor provinces in the Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and Hellenistic periods were in cultural contact with those empires. Already from its beginnings in the 9th and 8th century BC, the biblical literature was deeply influenced by the ideologies of the contemporaneous empires, particularly of Mesopotamia, but also of Egypt that dominated the southern Levant in the first millennium BC. In traditional as well as in recent scholarship, the ancient Near Eastern ideas and concepts were often approached and described as the context of Scripture, but in a historical perspective, it actually would be rather the other way around. The center is not the Bible, but the literatures of the ancient Near Eastern empires, and the Bible should be understood as the wider context of these texts. The reverse perception is, of course, due to the immense cultural historical weight of the Bible, but this is an ex post phenomenon. If my topic, the biblical literature from the Achaemenid period, had been brought up 150 years ago, it would have been highly controversial for two reasons. First of all, it was highly contested which texts and parts of the Hebrew and Aramaic Bible might have originated from the Achaemenid period aside from Ezra, Nehemia, Chronicles, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Daniel, all of which play out in an at least partial Persian setting and or mention Persian kings. Julius Wellhausen, one of the champions of biblical studies in the 19th century, wrote at the very beginning of his seminal Prolegomena zur Geschichte Israel, "It is an opinion very extensively held that the great mass of the books of the Old Testament not only relate to the pre-exilic period, but date from it." This sentence was written in 8082, and indeed, at that time and beforehand, biblical scholars essentially relied on the self-presentation of the biblical books in order to date them. According to this view, the whole sequence of the 9 books from Genesis to Kings, spanning the world history from creation to the fall of Jerusalem in 587 BCE, stemmed from the monarchic and possibly even the pre-monarchic periods in Israel and Judah. This changed with scholars like Eduard Reuss, Karl Heinrich Graf, Abraham Kühnen, and then, of course, with Wellhausen himself, who established the view that significant portions of the Pentateuch, including its main narrative thread or source, the so-called priestly document P, and most of its cultic legal material, which also belongs to P, postdates the Judean monarchy and should be assigned to the early Achaemenid period. With Wellhausen and his cohort, it became necessary to distinguish between the biblical and the historical perspective on the history of Israel and its literature, which is nowadays an uncontested standard in biblical scholarship wherever it is conducted in a historical and critical way. The biblical and the historical perspectives on the Hebrew Bible do not coincide. Rather, the biblical literature often projects its later thoughts back into earlier historical periods. And therefore, many texts, particularly from the so-called Pentateuch, the Torah, were assigned to the period of the Achaemenids by biblical scholarship of the past 150 years. The reasons were manifold. It became clear that already the oldest literary sources of the Pentateuch presuppose texts of the prophetic literature that do not predate the 8th century BCE, and scholars like Philip Davis pointed out that the Pentateuch is basically as he called it, an exilic document, not only in historical but also in conceptual terms. Most of its narrative takes place outside of the land of Israel, and when scenes do take place within the land, the ancestors of Israel are designated as strangers in their own land. So in Genesis 12 to 36. In recent years, more traditional datings for some texts of the Pentateuch, at times reaching back behind the discussion of Wellhausen, have been proposed on the basis of their linguistic outlook. The Pentateuch is mostly written in classical biblical Hebrew and not in late biblical Hebrew. And on the basis of the observation that there has been almost no inscriptions in Hebrew from the Persian period found in Judah and Jerusalem, so that some scholars concluded that biblical literature traditionally assigned to the Persian period should be dated either earlier or later, or should be located elsewhere than in Judah or Jerusalem, for instance in Babylonia or Egypt. But these very general proposals have not won the day, at least not around the globe. This is true in part because the use of classical biblical Hebrew is not just dependent upon time, but also upon social class. It is particularly the traditional language of the Torah, which could be emulated also in many later additions to it or in texts that present themselves as Torah-like, like, for example, the book of Joshua. The absence of Hebrew inscriptions in the Achaemenid period might have occurred for a variety of reasons, and the relative dating of biblical texts forces us to assume that quite a bit of the biblical literature originated indeed from Jerusalem in that time. At least in continental Europe, there is a certain consensus that significant portions of the Pentateuch stem from the Achaemenid period, for instance, the priestly document P, and vast parts of Leviticus and Numbers, various sections of the prophetical books, particularly in 2nd and parts of 3rd Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Haggai, Zechariah, Ezra, Nehemia, the book of Job, and a number of Psalms. Particularly for the book of Numbers, Hans-Peter Mattis could demonstrate in many places how close Numbers is to the book of Chronicles, which points to a similar historical setting in the Achaemenid period. Some of these texts were probably written in Babylonia, for example, P, 2nd Isaiah, and Ezekiel. Others may have originated from Persian period Jerusalem. Secondly, there was a hot debate in the 19th century between Julius Wellhausen and Eduard Meyer about what role the Achaemenid Empire played in the development of what both Meyer and Wellhausen called Judaism, by which they referred to the post-exilic Judaism as an ethno-religious entity following the loss of temple, king, and state, but with a certain religious coherence that, however, as we know particularly from Elephantini, could be rather fluid. Meyer stated that the genesis of post-exilic Judaism can only be understood as a product of the Achaemenid Empire, or, as we rather might put it today, as a reaction to the Achaemenid Empire, while Wellhausen was not willing to accept such an extent of Persian influence in the formation of Judaism. However, Meyer was not as wrong as Wellhausen thought, but Wellhausen's influence and exceptional standing in biblical scholarship let his own position prevail for quite some decades. It was only in the late 50s of the 20th century that a contextual interpretation of the writings of early post-exilic Judaism became more and more accepted. In 1959, Otto Plöger, a professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Bonn in Germany, published a monograph entitled Theocracy and Eschatology that is no longer very well known. Nevertheless, in the first decade after its publication, the book, or we should rather say the booklet, it's only 142 pages long, was rather successful. It saw 3 editions in German and was even translated into English. In his book, Plöger reconstructs a basic bifurcation in the political and theological thinking of Judaism during the Achaemenid period as attested in biblical literature. The Jewish literature of that era, according to him, covers a spectrum between theocratic positions that approve of the Achaemenid Empire and interpret it as a legitimate expression of God's rule and as something like the end of history, represented in texts like P and Chronicles, and eschatological positions, on the other hand, that instead argue for the contrary, that history has not yet come to an end, and that Israel must instead strive for national sovereignty, a Davidic kingdom, and the return of the diaspora. Of course, Plöger's choice terminology of theocratic and eschatological was unfortunate, because it was far too general and had very strong doctrinal overtones, because he himself admitted as such in the very first sentence of his book. But the poles of the political spectrum that Plöger identified provide a helpful starting point for assessing the biblical literature of the Achaemenid period. A similar distinction along the lines of Plöger was introduced into the discussion 1.5 decades later in 1975 by Paul Hansen's Dawn of Apocalyptic. Hansen differentiated between two camps: hierocratic priests on the one hand and visionary prophets on the other hand in the Second Temple period. Paul Hansen particularly draws on Karl Mannheim's basic distinction between ideologians and utopians in order to describe these two groups. Hansen also quotes Plöger's book, but only in passing, although there is a significant similarity between the conceptual evaluations of the biblical literature of the Achaemenid period. In what follows, I will very briefly name some key texts that illustrate this twofold approach to the Achaemenid rule in biblical literature. I will start with P as the representative of the theocratic option, and then I will move on to the book of Deuteronomy in its developed Persian edition in order to describe the eschatological option. One of the most prominent theocratic voices in the Hebrew Bible that goes back to the early Achaemenid period is the so-called priestly document in the Pentateuch, in short P. It's a bit difficult whether we really should speak of a document, but this is another discussion. The overwhelming majority of scholars date P to the late 6th century at the beginning of the Achaemenid period because of its decidedly monotheistic outlook, because of its construction of the central sanctuary as a tent in the desert of Sinai, because of its silence about kingship, and because of its detailed reception of Babylonian cosmology. P is not interested in national or international politics as long as the cult in Jerusalem is not affected. Since the Achaemenid Empire does not negatively interfere with that cult, foreign rule is acceptable for P. And P implicitly praises the Pax Persica, for example, in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10. P basically limits itself to describing how Israel's cultic institution emerges from its foundational history. Egypt, however, is not part of peaceful commonwealth of nations, which might hint towards a date for P before 526 BCE, the conquest of Egypt by Cambyses. Prior to this, Egypt was not part of the Achaemenid Empire, which could also explain why in P it is particularly Egypt's army, but not its population, that is eventually destroyed in the crossing of the sea in Exodus 14. Remarkably, the overall politico-theological structure of the word, according to P, seems to mirror a basic Achaemenid imperial concept. P differentiates between the world cycle, the Abrahamic cycle in Genesis, and the Israel's circle in Exodus. It represents a concentric theological organization of the world in which the creator God is Elohim for the world, El Shaddai for the Abrahamic people, and he is Yahweh for Israel. This conception is quite close to the Achaemenid view of center and periphery within their empire, if we can rely on Herodotus in his histories. P's programmatic and specific use of Elohim without a definite article is as a proper noun to speak of the one and only God, mirrors the absolute use of basileus in Herodotus's histories, which is also given without an article to designate the one and only Persian great king. One can even adduce that this occurs not necessarily as a result of direct influence, but as a parallel phenomenon. P is thus theocratic in nature and seems to interpret the Achaemenid period as the end of history. God does no longer have to interfere within world history. Apparently, P is securing this perspective in direct interaction with prophetic statements that tell the reader otherwise, as can be evinced from the well-known passage in the priestly flood account in Genesis 6-9. This harsh statement of the end that has come is not a formulation invented by P, but it is a quote from Amos 8, from a prophecy of judgment that is also reflected in Ezekiel 7. In Genesis 6:13, P takes up the message of earlier prophecies of doom, but refracts it prehistorically. Yes, there has been a divine decree to end, but it is in the past, not in the future. P thus relegates God's comprehensive will of judgment back to the mythic past. For the present and for the future, the promises of Genesis 9 are the binding expression of God's will, or eternal will. He guarantees the world eternal continuance and promises to spare it from catastrophes like the flood, which took place once and for all in the past. In Genesis 9, God places the relaxed war bow in the clouds and guarantees the creation permanent existence. God renounces here thus all violence after he exercised prehistorically once for all violence against kol basar, all flesh, in the previously narrated flood. But P's theocratic stance and its criticism of the prophetic tradition can be discerned in this relocation of the cosmic catastrophe from the end to the very beginning of the world history. Let us now turn to the eschatological side of the spectrum. Within biblical literature, it is mainly the corpus of the Deuteronomistic and prophetic literature of that time that has to be mentioned here. Aside from the theocrats or ideologists, as Hansen has it, there were also nationalists that can be deemed either as eschatologists, according to Plöger, or utopians, according to Hansen, that were of the opinion that the Achaemenid rule was hardly a godsend, but sooner or later would have to be overthrown by God himself in order to re-establish a Davidic monarchy in Israel again. For the option of a sooner collapse, Haggai 2, a prophetic book that is dated to the second year of Darius, provides a striking example. This oracle reckons with an imminent end of foreign rule, in this case with the end of the Achaemenid Empire. The goal is to re-establish a Davidic monarchy with Zerubbabel as its first post-exilic representative. A more eschatological-oriented text in terms of the expectation of a divine intervention in a more distant future is the book of Deuteronomy in its Persian edition, which includes texts like Deuteronomy 4 and 30. Both texts already thematize in their narrative setting before the conquest of the land that Israel will eventually lose its land and be scattered among the nations. Deuteronomy 33 is formulated quite similarly. Exile and return seem to be historical realities that are presupposed by the authors of Deuteronomy 4 and 30. Israel's existence in the diaspora seems to be quite advanced, as the motive of the end of heavens in both texts indicates. According to Deuteronomy 30, Israel's restoration is impossible without a fundamental anthropological transformation of the returnees. Keeping God's commandments, according to Deuteronomy 30, is only possible for a renewed Israel with a circumcised heart, a motive that Deuteronomy has taken up from prophecy. See, for instance, Jeremiah 4, Ezekiel 44, in addition to the prophecies about a new heart or a heart of flesh replacing a heart of stone in Jeremiah 32 and Ezekiel 36. The authors of Deuteronomy 30 in the Achaemenid period apparently believed that Israel's condition was a deficient one that needed to be changed by divine intervention. The international political situation is evaluated completely negatively by Deuteronomy 30 as well. Israel's heart, in modern terms its mind, has to be changed and its enemies have to be punished. Of course, one might think first of the Babylonians as these enemies, but probably all empires ruling over Israel and Judah are in view here, including the Achaemenids. And only after those interventions will God provide his full blessing upon Israel. This outlook is concentrated on very elementary aspects of rural life, and it does not touch upon further social or political aspects of the restoration. It is interesting that Deuteronomy 30 is in a certain sense also a theocratic text, but it postpones the theocracy from the present to the future. There will be no special need for a Davidic king. There may be one, as the king's law in Deuteronomy 17 has it, but he is of minor importance and he has to adhere to the law. The overall eschatological quality of this perspective of Deuteronomy 30 is finally highlighted by the final statement that links protology and eschatology together. The goal of God's history with his people at its end is identical to that of its origins. If we look back on Deuteronomy 4 and 30 and compare these texts with P, then it's fairly obvious that these two strands of tradition represent two very different intellectual attitudes towards the Achaemenid Empire. Deuteronomy, in its Achaemenid edition, evaluates its own present negatively overall. Israel anthropologically lacks the capacity to follow the law. Obeying the laws is a prerequisite to attaining the divine blessing over everyday life. The Babylonians and the Achaemenids will be cursed, and only in a divinely organized new future will good life be possible and guaranteed. The present is deficient, only the future is bright and positive. It's probably not too far-fetched to assume that Deuteronomy, at least in certain parts, is polemicizing against P. Why? Firstly, human beings, according to P, are created perfectly as the image of God, as Genesis 1 famously states. However, according to Deuteronomy 36, this is not true. Humans must wait until their divine recreation in order to comply with God's will. Secondly, P holds a very peaceful worldview, while Deuteronomy 37 claims that all enemies of Israel will be punished by God. Thirdly, P is a diaspora-friendly text. Nothing indicates that living abroad would be an impossible option for P. Even the sanctuary, the tent of meeting, was founded abroad in the sands of the desert of Sinai. Conversely, Deuteronomy 30 sees only a possible and prosperous future for Israel in the land of its ancestors. And to get back to its land, God himself will become active again. The Achaemenid period, according to Deuteronomy 30, does not signify the end of history. This would be peace position, but it is a time of decisive divine creational activity. I'm coming to my very last short section. P and Deuteronomy no longer exist as independent texts. They are integrated into the Pentateuch. The sheer co-presence of P and D elements in the Pentateuch attests to the will of its composers to integrate these diverging traditions into a single document, which apparently is the result of an ideological compromise. Because of this, the question immediately arises, why were these divergent traditions combined in one textual corpus, the Pentateuch? One answer is offered in a theory developed by Erhard Blum and Peter Fry in the 80s of the last century. The compromise comes from the Achaemenid imperial authorization of local regulations, and the Torah might have been the result of such an imperial authorization of local laws, although this is a contested theory. Second Temple Judaism was forced to present a set of laws that represented all its ideological and theological strands, and the result of this enterprise was a Pentateuch comprising both P and Deuteronomy, which thus represented a good compromise of Israelite and Judean reactions to the Achaemenid Empire. Thank you for your attention.